Hey all, it's Nicole Masarova again from Our Shared Learning, the tutoring program that was created amidst the pandemic to aid during distance learning. Today's focus is going to be the story arc and the hero's journey, which is especially important if you're in middle school or high school and you're reading a book for school. Both of these are very commonly referred to in the regular curriculum. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over both of them, and then at the end of the video, if you just want to head straight to the practice, we will be outlining both of them using Cinderella. If you'd like to follow along in the presentation, feel free to click the link below. If you'd like to see the outlines for fill in your own story arc or fill in your own hero's journey, those are also linked below. Feel free to check it out, and why don't we get started? All right, so today's focus is going to be the story arc and hero's journey walkthrough. Let's start with actually first talking about the story arc. So what exactly are the story arc and hero's journey, you might ask? Well, it's the way that the plot is structured in any narrative. Any single narrative that you can find will be able to be formatted in these two ways, the story arc and the hero's journey. We're going to start with the story arc because that one's a little bit simpler to understand. So this is the simplest demonstration of what the story arc is it has all of these areas, and it kind of shows like how intense the story is. Right at the beginning, it's pretty easy, zero stress. Then it gets more and more stressful as we reach the most intense part of the story. Then it begins dropping down and is resolved, right? So there's nothing happening, so that's why it's a flat line. Both of these are the start and the end, and both of them are flat because in that case there's no events happening that are changing the intensity of the plot, right? So let's start covering the vocabulary one by one. Exposition. The exposition is a fancy word for basically saying what is normal, right? It sets the stage for who our main character is, who their friends are, what's the setting, are we in the future, the past, the present, are we in New York or are we in Texas, right? Like that is the setting. So the basic time, place, what kind of world does this character live in? Are they poor? Are they rich? Are they angry? Are they sad? How many family members do they have? Did a family member die, right? So all of the basic information of the character is what we learn here. So we begin to kind of learn about what kind of life they've led so far. Have they had a good life? Have they had a bad life? What kind of world are they living in? So like, are they living in the Hunger Games where we're in the future and people live in districts? Are we living in the past during the colonization of the Americas where there were like natives everywhere and we just had colonies, you know? So that's what the exposition does, is it really sets the stage for what is the background information you need to know going into the story. Next, this isn't labeled on here, but it's called the inciting incident. Let me spell that out loud for you guys. So it's the inciting incident. That's how you spell it. So the inciting incident essentially means that it's something that triggers a change in our main character's world. So it's the first thing that shows us, hey, something's changing, something is new here, right? We start getting our main question of the story introduced. You might not know exactly what it is yet, but maybe like in this case, the main character learns something about their dad, who they haven't seen for 12 years. So it starts this chain of events of, well, is my dad alive? I thought he was dead this whole time, right? So it's like the first thing that is different from our normal, right? The reason why this is flat is because this is normal. The character's life is normal. There's nothing strange about it. This is the first moment where something new has happened and the character's life is beginning to change. It's not just normal anymore. It's beginning to be a new kind of world. So that's where our arc starts going up. Next, you can see we have the rising action. So this rising action is a general word for everything from the inciting incident all the way to the climax, and it includes obstacles. So any book that you read, any story that you read, it doesn't matter if it's a short story or not, everywhere here, you're going to meet obstacles that this character, it will first be like, oh my gosh, how do I get through it? And then they'll find a way to power through obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And it can be anywhere from they lose their best friend to they hurt their foot, right? So it's everything that's preventing them from answering their question. So in the example of the dad, is the dad alive? This would be anything preventing them from being able to find the answer, whether it's government officials or something personal. There's a lot of obstacles that can happen here, and it can there's usually going to be like 2 or 3 of the biggest obstacles, and then you're going to have like a million tiny ones depending on how long the book is. And we move further and further away from the normal, right? As you can see, the intensity is increasing. So usually the obstacles down here are the ones that you feel the most, right? Like, oh, this character was almost there. Why couldn't they get through it? Because the energy level is so high that later in the book, all these obstacles seem to be magnified significantly. Next, we have our climax. So the climax is the turning point in the book. This is the moment in the book where our story's question is answered. If you weren't sure what the story was until now, I'm sure you figured it out somewhere over here. During the last half of the Rising Action, you will know what the question is, I promise you. The question can be anywhere from, if you have ever read Harry Potter, then the question for like basically all 7 books is, will Harry Potter be able to defeat Voldemort, right? Like that's the book, that's the question that spans over all 7 series, and you can break it down into book by book, but I'm not going to do that because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. If you've read The Hunger Games, will Katniss Everdeen win the Hunger Games, right? Like these are the big main idea questions and this climax is the moment where you get it answered. Yes or no, Katniss does not win the Hunger Games. Yes, she wins the Hunger Games. Harry Potter, yes, Harry Potter does beat Voldemort, or no, Harry Potter doesn't beat Voldemort, right? Like that, this climax is where that question is answered. And you know it's answered because the character has grown, right? They're growing into kind of a new person. And during this falling action is when, let's say like there's usually a climax in like a dystopian novel will have a huge battle scene or something really intense. So falling action is when they clean up the mess right after the battle. So it's everything that happens just after the climax. The resolution is traditionally a couple of days later, a couple hours later, kind of like a wrap up from the story. Sometimes this can be seen as like a 1 year later type of thing, 15 years later, right? So, or sometimes that can be the epilogue, right? The lines here are a little blurred, but the resolution is the new normal. So the resolution, I don't know if you can tell, but look, so the exposition and the resolution are at different levels, right? So they're not exactly the same place because the character has grown, right? So he can't end up in the same place, or she or they can't end up at the same place if they've changed along the way. And because they've changed throughout the story, then they're no longer at the same place that they started with. And if you're like reading the series, this can be book 1, right? Here's the first story arc. This is book 2. Then you have book 3. All of these story arcs connect because the ending of one story is the beginning of another. I know that sounds metaphorical, but that's genuinely how it works, right? Like if you look at a 7-book series, it'll literally look like this. Like it is a constant stream of like new normal, new normal, new normal. And the story keeps changing, right? It's only constant when nothing new is happening. So that's kind of the biggest ideas of this story arc. At least these 5 words on here you need to know. Inciting incident is also really important, but these are going to be the main things that you do want to know. I mean, all teachers use this when they're discussing books. All teachers use this when they're discussing literally anything. It's going to be really hard if you don't know what they mean. So just, if you ever need to check back anything, just go back, re-watch something. If you have any questions, comment below, but really understand what this story arc is. It's kind of the path that the whole story takes, and it's all from the same point of view, right? Usually in a book, you have one point of view. If you don't, then your story arc is going to look a little bit different because, you know, you have different people experiencing different things. So maybe you have two story arcs, one for each character. But usually when you have a book from one point of view, you're only going to have one story arc and it's going to cover everything. So let's keep going. The next step is hero's journey. Some teachers like to cover this, some don't. So honestly, if you want to go ahead and just practice story arc, go ahead, fast forward through this bit, go check out our practice. It's going to be right after this. But I'm going to cover hero's journey just in case because I want to make sure that you guys are all getting the information that you need. So the hero's journey is a really interesting take on the story arc. It's very similar. They have a lot of similar ideas, but I like the fact that it's a loop. So it's kind of like it's a circle and it kind of shows that it never ends, right? A hero's journey never ends. It really never ends until, I don't know, like they die, but that's like really dark, right? But a true hero's journey is a cycle. Every time something ends, another thing begins, right? So this one is a little bit more limiting towards the setting and towards the resolution. It spends a lot more time talking about the rising action and the falling action, but it kind of keeps the falling action like half and half, right? So this is the rising action, this is the falling action. In our story arc, it makes it seem like the falling action is smaller than the rising action, but in the hero's journey, what they try to do is they break it down so that it has just as many ticks as the rising action, right? So we see that it's pretty balanced, and it's a great way to check for understanding. Like, did you really understand what this character has just gone through? Especially if it was like a really long journey, then it's a great way to see how the character has reflected upon themselves. Because this entire part here is the character reflecting on what happened to them while they were taking a journey, right? So why don't we start talking one by one. So first, here's the normal world, here's the unknown, right? So sometimes the unknown can literally be another planet. Sometimes it'll be a different house. In the case of the Hunger Games, this is like the Hunger Games arena, right? But sometimes it can literally just be the normal world, but with a new piece of information that seems to change the world for the character. So our start is our call to adventure. So that basically just means, what is something that has inspired the character to either behave differently, ask new questions? There's going to be something that's going to drive the character to seek adventure. And we don't know what that adventure is yet, but it's something that's calling them, right? And on their way, they're going to meet a mentor or a friend, somebody who knows about this, right? Like, that's almost inevitable. Sometimes a mentor can be in the form of a book, in the form of a fairy, who knows, right? Like, a mentor is really just a word for somebody who, or something that helps them learn more. So in the case of like, in the case of Mamma Mia, I don't know if you guys are familiar with that story, but there's like, a girl is trying to find who's her dad, right? Then she finds a diary that gives 3 guys names that could potentially be her dad. So in that story, the mentor isn't any person. It's a diary that lists names that continues to guide this main character on a journey and continues propelling that question, who is my dad, right? Like, trying to solve that question. And after they meet the mentor, they cross the threshold. That's a really fancy word for saying crossing the bridge and committing to finding the answer. So it's not really like it's not as much of an event that happens. Sometimes it is, but it's the moment when the character decides, okay, I am actually going to go on this adventure. I want to find the answer, and I'm not going to stop until I get it. So it's a moment where the character reflects and is like, okay, I want to learn more and I will learn more. Now, on the way, they have trials and failures. So these are the obstacles that we were talking about in the story arc. And on the way, they usually meet a helper or two, right? So they gain friends along the way that help them grow. And that part's pretty obvious, right? So in order to get through some obstacles, they might have to find friends, or they might have to learn new skills, right? So along the way, this character is learning new things about themselves, and this helps them grow new skills. Now, this death and rebirth is the same thing as the climax in the story arc. The reason why it's called death and rebirth is it can mean one of two things. The first is that it's the death of the main character as they were, and it's their rebirth into this new person that they've become, because they've changed so much that they've shed their old self and become a new person. It can also mean the actual death of a friend or the rebirth of some sort of long-lost relationship, right? So in a climax, sometimes the main character will lose somebody that's important to them, and that's the death. The rebirth can also be if they rekindle a connection to somebody that they didn't have a connection for a long time. For example, in the case of the dad, if they find out that he's alive, then this main character would reconnect with the father, and it would be the rebirth of their relationship. So this climax can be seen of one of two things. One, it's the death of the main character as they were, and they are reborn into their new person who they've grown into, or it can be the death of an actual friend and the rebirth or rekindling of a relationship. So right now, this climax, this part is the same as the climax right here. So like, just keep in mind that even though we're doing two separate forms of plots, right? Like we're plotting the chain of events in a different way, they're still very much connected, and you can see similarities all the time. The trials and failures are right there. Crossing the threshold is going to be right here. The call to adventure is the same thing as the inciting incident. So you can see how they kind of mesh together and how they're really connected. So by understanding one, you can also understand the other. Let's keep going. The revelation can sometimes be a reflection that the main character has. So it's usually going to be something new that they learn. So for example, if we're talking about a wizarding world, right? Like a revelation can be a new power that they just discovered that they're able to. In the middle of a huge fight, they discover that they have this new power and ability. And when they realize that they want to use it and they want to stay this new person that they've become, they finally change. So let's go over that one more time. This death and rebirth, if the character is shedding their old skin and becoming a new person, this revelation is the realization that they've changed, right? And the realization that they've changed sometimes comes with feelings of, actually, I don't want to change. I don't want to change my entire life, right? But the revelation is the moment where they're like, oh, I've changed and I want to stay changed, right? I want the new world. And that's why they finally end up changing. They finally accept the fact that the world is not going to be the same again for them. And that's why they change. And so atonement, real quick, I'm going to show you guys the dictionary definition because I don't want to misquote it, right? So atonement definition. So the definition of atonement is the reparation for offense or injury. Now that you guys have gotten the official dictionary definition, I'm going to rephrase that. So atonement is basically repairing what's been done wrong, aka cleaning up the wreckage after a fight. So the same thing that I was talking about before, this is kind of the falling action where they're repairing the wreckage. Any people who are fighting, or let's say there are two friends that were angry at each other during the climax, this is the moment where they apologize to each other and become friends again. So it's repairing old wounds and old bonds. So it's basically making up for anything that they did wrong for each other. Then next up is gets gift. This can be extremely vague. So sometimes it can be a gift like from the mentor that they met at the beginning. It can be a gift, like a physical gift, maybe like it's an elixir or something like that. But getting the gift is basically just something that they get from this new world that they've been, that they keep and take with them. So they return with the gift, and they return changed because they accepted that they wanted to be changed. And so they like come back home, and the coolest part about that, I think the hero's journey shows well, is that their end is now their normal world, right? They basically they went into the unknown, changed their life, but now their life that they changed is their normal, right? So it's kind of saying um like if this girl meets her dad, and they mend their relationship, her new normal is going to be living life with her dad, right? It's not the unknown anymore because it's going to be her normal from now on. So, and then it keeps on going on a loop and a loop and a loop. And I promise you can break this down as many times as you want. This will be visible in every single narrative. All right, so if you guys have any more questions, feel free to comment below, but we are going to, yeah, so it goes on a loop and a loop and a loop. I forgot to say that, but we're going to practice the story arc next. We're going to do it with the story of Cinderella because why not, right? Might as well. So I think it's the simplest one that almost everyone knows. If you want a refresher on the actual story, go ahead and click the link. The link is in the slideshow below. And there's also a separate link just for the Cinderella story so that you guys can read through it without having to open the presentation. But go ahead, take a second to review if you need to. Put me on pause. But if you remember the story of Cinderella, I'm just going to keep going. So here, this is what's linked below if you guys want to print this out and write it down in person. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep it here on the screen. So the exposition, aka what is normal, right? So Cinderella's mom died when she was little. The dad remarried to her new stepmother, and Cinderella's a servant for the stepfamily, right? That one's pretty clear. Everyone kind of knows that story. So up here, what's the inciting incident? Well, the inciting incident is that the king throws a ball to find a wife for his son, the prince, right? And that's what sends everybody into a frenzy. Everyone wants to go to the ball. Now, take a second and think what happens between the king throwing a ball to find a wife for his son and his son, the prince, finding someone to marry, right? There's a bunch of obstacles. Go ahead and take a second. In a second, I'll review though. All right, so in case you still need more time, go ahead and put me on pause. Take your time. Practice this yourself. I'm going to say here are just some examples of obstacles. There are probably a million more that I skipped, but the first and most basic one is Cinderella needs a dress, right? In the movie, she makes her own dress. Then her stepsisters destroy the dress. So right after she made a dress and crossed through this obstacle, she got another one, right? They destroyed the dress. And the way that she gets through here is her fairy godmother makes her a dress. Then how is she going to get to the ball? Well, her fairy godmother makes a pumpkin into a carriage. She gets to the ball and she wants to marry the prince. But what gets in the way? The clock strikes 12. She has to go. Now, there's a couple more, but I just couldn't fit them on here. Our climax is when the prince is bringing the shoe around, and he's trying to see, does the shoe fit, right? So real quick, I was talking about the main question of the story. So the climax answers the main question of the story. I just want to make sure this is very clear. The main question is, does Cinderella get the prince? Now, it seems super obvious, but sometimes it's not that clear, right? But usually the main question is going to be as simple as that, yes or no. It's going to be answered at the climax. So at the climax, when he's trying on the shoe, does the shoe fit? Yes. So Cinderella does get the prince, right? So that's like where the climax is. It's where the question that is driving the entire story gets answered. And so when he tries the shoe on and it fits, turns out he loves her and they kiss, right? That's the falling action. The resolution is what happens next. So she marries the prince, they live happily ever after, and the stepsisters and stepmother, they all, they live their own lives. They're not really like, Cinderella's still nice to them, but they're still a little envious. But That's the resolution, because that's the new normal. And so in case any of this wasn't clear, go ahead and watch it one more time. But the main thing that I'd say is if you can find, so I'm going to highlight the biggest points that you need to know first before filling anything else out. You're going to want to know what the exposition is, the inciting incident, the climax, and the resolution. Once you know these 4 points, these are the first 4 points that you should do. Once you know these 4 points, you can break it down and do these details in between. But if you don't know the 4 biggest points, you're never going to be able to do the details because you won't know what time frame you're working in. If you don't know that the inciting incident is the ball and you don't know that the climax is when the prince is trying the shoe on Cinderella, you won't know what obstacles to use because you don't know like how long of a time we're talking about, right? So make sure that you start with those 4 points. Then when you're done, you can go ahead and fill out the in-between. All right. Now, go ahead if you are not interested in practicing the hero's journey. Feel free to escape now. That's all we're going to be doing for the rest of today. We're going to practice the hero's journey and filling it out also with Cinderella, just because I think it's easy, you know, like, and it also shows us the similarities between the two, right? So let's start with the call to adventure. So Cinderella's call to adventure is the ball. She wants to go to the ball. Meanwhile, her mentors are all of her mice and little animals, right? So her mentors aren't actually people, they're animals that help her try to get to the ball. The moment she crosses the threshold is where she decides, I am going to the ball. And in the movie, it's when she decides to make the dress because she's finally made a commitment. That's the key thing, is going into the unknown world is the moment you make a commitment. That's crossing the threshold. You can be all talk, but the moment you make a commitment and actually do an action to try to achieve your goal, that is crossing the threshold. Then her trials and her failures are everything up until she gets to the ball, right? Her helper in this case is the fairy godmother, right? Like that's the person that basically helps her through everything. Her new skills, like her growth, in this case, you know, it might not seem really obvious, but some of her new skills are, well, first of all, dancing, right? Like without that, the prince wouldn't fall in love with her. But like one of the biggest growth and new skills that happens here is her relationship with the prince, right? So it's a growth because in that case, after that, he goes hunting for her. So in this case, the growth isn't actually just in her, it's in the growth of a relationship. And that's what leads to our death and rebirth. Now, in this case, it's no one actually dies, right? None of her friends really die. It's the death of Cinderella as a servant, and it's the rebirth of her as a royal, right? Because with the moment she gets serious with the prince is the moment that she is no longer a servant for her stepsisters. And that revelation right there is when she realizes, well, I'm with the prince now, and do I want to be a royal? She changes when she says yes to the marriage. Like, do you see how there, like, the revelation is, okay, I understand that things are new, but she finally changes when she actually accepts being a royal, when she accepts the prince's hand in marriage, right? So there's a little bit of a distinction there. The death and the rebirth is like part 1, right? She is officially a new person. She has a new status in the world because the prince loves her, but she finally changes when she actually marries him. And the atonement is Cinderella didn't really do any wrongs in the Disney version of the story, right? She was nice to everybody. So the only real atonement is when the stepmother and the stepsisters are still envious, but Cinderella is forgiving, right? She's like, I forgive you, you know, you guys are fine, whatever. And her gift that she kind of carries with her is the gift of royalty, right? So the reason why I say the gift of royalty is because that's what changes her unknown world into her normal world, right? So if she wasn't given the gift of royalty, she would have to go back to the place where her stepmother and stepsisters lived. But because she's a royal now, her new gift is royalty, and she stays in the castle, and the castle, which used to be her unknown, is now her normal world because she's currently like going to live in the castle. And so she returns to the castle changed because no longer is she a visitor in the castle, but she is an owner of the castle essentially. And it brings us to the end, which is her just being in a happy marriage with the prince, which we don't really see in the movie because it kind of cuts off after the wedding. But we see that she's still friends with all of her animals, right? The prince really loves her, and that is the beginning for Cinderella 2. Now, we're not actually going to do that today, but it's just kind of a cool idea since we know that the hero's journey is a cycle. Cinderella 2 starts right where Cinderella 1 left off, and that's why this is like a continuous loop. All right, so that's pretty much it for today. Let me know if you guys have any questions. I hope that wasn't too boring. All of the resources we used today are linked below. If you want some more practice alone, feel free to like comment or use any of the links below. Let me know what you guys want to work on next, and I hope you guys have a wonderful night. Once again, my name is Nicole Masarova, and I'm a tutor at Our Shared Learning, and we love helping out you guys. So have a wonderful night.